It's Don here from the board. Thank you for coming along and checking out this video. So, in this video, it's going to be a little bit... Hey, settle down. It's going to be a little bit different to what I had originally intended because with the holidays, you know, because of this little one here and whatnot, I don't think I'm going to be able to have the time to do a live stream build for my FHAN Pad, which I originally planned to do. And so I am going to build it progressively, and I'm going to probably do it as a time lapse because, you know, building it is not really terribly different to building any other of the keyboards that I've done. It's a matter of just compiling diodes, the switches through a plate, having a microprocessor attached, and in this case a Pro Micro, and so it's fairly straightforward. I guess it's really just more of the interaction between you guys, the watchers of the videos, and attending the live stream that I'm going to miss in that aspect. But I thought I would just go through the bits and pieces that I will actually be using in the build and sort of just talk through them. And then of course we'll go into, whenever I do video magic, to have the time lapse. So let's switch over to the desk and we can have a squiz of what's happening here. So of course, on the right over this side is actually my FHAN Pad PCB that I did the video on the other day. You know, I still love the fact that I made this and I hope it will work out all right. Still love the silk screen and the logo on it. And yeah, I've shown it a couple of people at work and they thought it was pretty cool. Hopefully it will accumulate to something useful. Now, I do have my 3D printed and designed sort of plate and housing for it. It's just a very simple open design. The PCB will go into the back. The switches, of course, will go through. This is actually a version 2.5. I've done some changes to it because the original version that I had, which kind of didn't fully print, the actual mount holes for the stabilizers was too tight a tolerance, and the stabilizers didn't fit properly, and also the thickness of the plate, because I made this using the Swirl KB plate design. I didn't realize that you needed more gap space around for the actual base of the PCB mount stabilizers that I'm going to be using. So in the revision, I actually increased the width of that, which now should give enough clearance. There is a secondary aspect that I hadn't really thought about, but came to me while I was not prototyping, when I was testing this for fitment, and it was that I'd put these support bars in, and the thickness, while it's perfect for the switches to go through, it doesn't leave a lot of space for the actual diode joints when you solder them through. Now, of course, with the PCB orientation to be like that, the diodes are actually going to be on the back here, but the actual joints normally, if I solder them the way I do, will actually be on the other side, and they'll be too large and too lumpy to actually connect because the thickness of the actual top plate is about 3.5 mil. So I have actually revised the PCB case design here, which I'm happy to release at a future date depending on how things go, but I've made it thinner, and of course that just means it'll be a little bit more flexible, unless if you use a higher infill, that kind of thing. But at 3.5 mil I was quite happy because it's quite solid. There's not really a lot of flex, and I would imagine that I would actually be pressing on these switches that hard to encounter a lot of flex on it. But it does mean I will be using a slightly different soldering method, which is to solder and tack the diodes on the same side as the diodes through the through hole rather than onto the back like I normally do. So besides that, of course, I've got some PCB mounted stabilizers that I'll be using here. I've got some cherry and Gatoron green switches. I didn't actually have enough Gatoron green switches, so I'll be using 5, I think, cherry MX green switches, but I'll be using them primarily on the print screen, scroll lock, and pause break, plus Numlock key, and possibly one of these FROW function keys that I don't use very often, probably like F12 or something like that. We'll just have to wait and see. Or maybe it'll go on to insert, because really, who uses insert? Now, besides that, there's the Pro Micro, as I said. I've also got 42 diodes for this build, and I will be using at some point what my daughter's playing with right now, which is the double leg, just over there so people can see it. Oh, thank you. the diode bender that I designed and shown off in the previous video. So that's pretty much it. Of course, I've got my quad hands over here. I've got soldering. I've got solder over there. I've got some snips, of course, and then I've also got the TS100 soldering iron that is in this nifty little package. So they're all the things that I will be using, and yeah, I'll build that hopefully as a time lapse and whatnot. I have already pre-flashed this Pro Micro with the layout for this, but I'll talk a bit more about that in the concluding part of this whole complete video if everything goes according to plan. So that's it. Hopefully the build will go successfully, and towards the end of this video we'll see how it turns out. So I hope you enjoy the time lapse and the build. Yeah, see how it goes. Cheers. Okay, so we have finished building the FHAN Pad, and let's check it out in real time, obviously, since you would have seen that I've just only done some very basic testing of its functionality in Notepad after I finished building it in the time lapse. It's got a bit of heft to it, but that's to be expected after you've added the switches and keycaps on it. I've put some white PBT keycaps, some cherry profile with front print on it that I got a really long time ago, and the rest of this set is actually on my GH60 build. The switches sit pretty well in the actual 3D printed case, though there's a little bit of lift on some of the corners because the case actually has a bit of warp when it's lifted off the build plate. I've put some big fat bump-ons on it to give it a bit of texture surface rather than it being sliding and sort of grinding on any fabric materials because of the layers of the actual print. The PCB sits in really well. As you can see, there's plenty of sort of gap clearance around the edge. It was a little bit tricky to actually solder along the edges because of the actual way that the case is mounted, but I still managed to do it in the end. I would say that if you were going to build something like this, a sandwich case is probably a lot easier to work with, simply because you would only have the plate layer to have to deal with, and then every other layer is going to be put together afterwards, rather than it being restricted from the angles that you can actually solder with. Pro Micro fits in fine. I didn't actually have to clip anything on this side, and as you might have seen in the build, there was actually enough clearance, even though I have a thicker plate, about 3.5mm on this, because it's a 3D printed plate, that the headers on the other side had needed clipping anyway. I did try to clip one, and I looked at it and I just went, you know, it doesn't really make a big difference overall, and hopefully it wouldn't impact the switches sitting in, which they haven't, so I'm really happy with that. And also with the test fit on the USB port, there's plenty of space for whatever size connector that you would actually be using in there anyway. If anything, I probably could have designed that to be a bit smaller, but I wasn't 100% sure how it would sit because I hadn't measured the height of the header pins and so forth. And it also means that if you did, when you put your Pro Micro on, not have it sitting flush against the header pins and there was a bit of angle, it wasn't going to be a negative aspect. Now, having this also means it's easy to flash because you can get to the reset pins really easily, but I didn't have a button or anything like that to put in, but I can. The only downside that I can kind of see and figure from this point right now is because it's open, if I'm turning it around, I've sort of stabbed my hands on touching bits and pieces in there. Be good if I had a bit of clear acrylic that I could somehow maybe just hot glue across the bottom, then I can just sort of pry it off if I needed to reflash it or something like that. But that said, I could probably actually angle something through this way from I mean, I've got heaps of space there, so I probably could actually get something in that way to reset it if I needed to, if I didn't want to take a backing piece off. So there's the layout. It seems to work pretty well. It's got a 5-degree angle on it and it's relatively comfortable. Of course, the height here, because it is quite thick, means it would work well or better with a wrist rest of your preference, because the angle of the wrist there is quite sharp, but that's okay because a lot of the keyboards that I use already have their feet up anyway, and at work, for example, I do use a wrist rest. So talking about the key mapping and the flashing and whatnot, I'm now just going to switch over to my other monitor and what I've got prepared there. Let's go over that way and we'll switch that and that off so it won't be distracting. So here's the layout in Keyboard Layout Editor. You can see my F keys over here, the home block, the arrow keys, numpad, and then the 3 additionals. In hindsight, because I actually sort of paired it with my GH60 after I'd finished building it just to see how it would look and feel and what kind of table space it took. I don't actually have the tilde key because on the GH60 it's been replaced by the escape key. So I probably could have actually put it here under the print screen just to, I suppose, make a complete keyboard, but to be honest, I don't really use it that much unless if I'm sort of chatting rather than work. And if I'm going to be writing approximate with that sort of tilde squiggle for work, I wouldn't be using that symbol anyway. So in order to build the firmware on it, we pretty much just grab the data from the raw data section here, and then I built my firmware using keyboardfirmware.com. Now this was created by Rui Kimao, and of course it runs off QMK firmware. So my board is powered by QMK. You just dump that layout in and then you can get into setting the matrix, setting the pins, and then setting the actual key map. And you can see along the top here, that's exactly what I've done. So I did this earlier before I finished building the board, so it was easy for me to flash the Pro Micro and I could get into it testing it straight away. And that is actually how I set up my matrix. And that is in line with how I originally designed my rows and columns, which I had mapped out during the schematic phase of building this PCB. You just have to tweak the rows and columns down here at the bottom, which of course is off the screen here in this picture, so that the key map actually matches the way that you've got it set up. Because the default rows and columns, it does something slightly different to the way that I had actually designed the PCB, and had I left it like that without adjusting it, obviously it wouldn't work. Now moving along onto the pinouts. So the Pro Micro has specific pinouts, and going back to my schematic, going back to the actual PCB and the pinout layouts, these are the pinouts for the way I've set up the PCB. So row 0 to 6 and column 0 to 6, I've got them as D1, D0, D4, C6, D7, E6, B4, and then for the columns it's F4, F5, F6, F7, then B1, B3, and B2. I'm not quite sure why they have that weird assignment, but I guess it's just the way that the Pro Micros are. And when I talk about that in context, is if you actually look at a picture of a Pro Micro, even the pins aren't in sequential order down each of the sides, and that's what really I'm talking about. So once you set that, make sure that it's at the Amiga 32U4, you can move on to the next section, which is mapping the key map. So there's just all the F blocks, print, screen, scroll, lock, pause, home block, arrow keys. But what's really important is that I'm using the pad version of these numbers, so that in theory it should actually work as a, a Numlock component. Because if you put just the numbers in rather than the keypad version of it, then the Numlock doesn't affect the output in getting, your up, down, left, right, as well as your home, page up, page down functionality. Now I haven't built any macros into it because there's no layers that I've built into this, so I didn't bother with the macro or any of the other bits. And then I just compiled a hex and JSON file, and I saved the zip as well, then flashed the Pro Micro. So it was pretty easy. It only took me probably about an hour. It's funny because I was talking to somebody about it and they went, oh no, it won't take you very long, but I said, I bet you it's going to take me an hour, and it actually did. It took me an hour and 1 minute, but that's because I was just going slow and making sure I got my key map. And then I had to look up the actual pinouts and then trace them back to make sure I used the right pin maps. And then of course manually clicking each one of these and going back through the menu and adding it to the key map here on the firmware. But at the end of the day, it turned out really, really great. And what I'm going to do now is we'll just have a look. Of course, you'll have to trust me since it's not on the screen as such, but I'm going to jack in the actual pad now. So there it is. You can see Numlock is actually just lit up. Now if I turn on the desk, you can see it just on the side of the video over here. So I'm just going to go to the side there. There it is plugged in. The light on the Pro Micro is working. And I'm just going to go to the Numlock part here. There's no LEDs built in on this, so that's why you're not going to see anything light up. But if I press this, oh, it's because I'm not in switch header. There we go. I'm back on switch header. And there we go. So Numlock is on, Numlock is off. So that seems to be working really well. And then as I go across, each one of these numpad features are lighting up. So now if I move across to the triple block there, and then I've got my arrow keys. So they all light up. The home block all light up. And then as I go across the function keys, they all work, which is really great. Now, of course, if I turn off the Numlock, turn off Numlock, turn off scroll lock, and then I do that, I'm still getting that feature, but in Notepad, as I'd shown previously, well, towards the end of the actual the build bit. So let's just turn that on. We'll go Numlock on, and let's just generate a bunch of numbers. And get a Now that's being held, so obviously it'll sound slightly different. A bit more thockiness now that it's on an actual table surface. But if I then turn off the numpad, you'll see there's the numpad, and if I press the up, it is moving up, and if I'm pressing down, it's moving down, left and right. And yeah, so in that context, it seems to be working pretty well. So there you have it, home and end. Now there's no pages for it to actually need the page up, page down part of it, but the rest of it seems to work really well. So there it is, FHAN Pad complete. Don't want to save that. Oh crap, wrong screen. I'm really pleased. I'm absolutely chuffed at the fact that I was able to create this, to make it in KiCad, to send it off to all PCB, have it come, be able to solder it, map it, plug it in, and just have a completely working product. I'm really proud of myself in being able to do that, because it's the first time I've gone, you know, from start to finish and have this. It's a great feeling to have. Gives me a lot more confidence as well now that if I want to design, you know, different things, macro pads or keyboard replacements or different form factors and sizes, I can certainly do it. And it's just a matter of the controller, so a Pro Micro for whatever size board, or of going to a Teensy or a Teensy, you know, 2++, 3+, or whatever it is for even bigger form factors or stranger arrays of keys. Where do we go from here? It's a really good question. I've still got a bunch of them available. I don't know if I really need to do too much testing. I may give 1 or 2 away as part of giveaways. We'll just have to see how that goes. And then I really need to know, well, I don't need to know, but at this point in time, it's a matter of if people in the community think this is worthwhile, that they want to get. You know, I can run an interest check, but whether that's going to be successful or not, and then if I actually want to run a group buy, you know, do I want to try and handle it myself? Do I try and go through a vendor and then they can manage the actual sales and inventory and shipping and stuff like that? There's a lot of questions up in the air, you know, but I think for the moment, we'll just go with how it is, which is it's not widely available. Of course, it doesn't mean anyone else can't make their own design and build off this kind of concept, but please let me know in the comments, either on the video or on Reddit or on Patreon, or email me and tell me, is this something that you're actually interested in having? Is this something that you're interested in building? Is this something that's going to be useful for you in your everyday keyboard use? Because if it is, then, you know, that will determine if I'm just going to be a good guy and release the Gerbers, make it easy, or if I want to just run a sale, because obviously if there's any profits that come from running a group buy and sale, it's going to be, of course, used to help the board, the channel, the podcast, and so on and so forth. Can't imagine it's something that I'm going to make a lot of money on, and, you know, to be honest, I'm not really here to be in the community to make money anyway. So there you go, there you have it. There is the FHAN Pad, the function, home block, arrow, and numpad board. And I was just saying to my wife earlier, actually, it's really funny because the rest of this set, as I said, is on my GH60, which isn't in this room right now, it's just somewhere else. That was the first keyboard that I've built, and I finally used the rest of that key set, which is on the latest keyboard that I built, and it's certainly not going to be the last keyboard that I built. So I think we're going to wrap it up there. Thank you very much for sort of checking out this video. Thank you very much for everyone who's been really supportive of the process, especially to Amtra and Zealous for helping me out with the design. Thanks for everybody who actually supported the concept of this and was giving me really great feedback when I was developing the actual form factor. And yeah, it's just been a really great journey. Lots of love. So with that, I am going to wrap up this video and then start doing the editing bits to put all of this together, because I've got to combine the 3 parts. And then, yeah, we'll see on whatever else it is that I'm working on. So, as always, until next time, happy clacking.